On a fateful day during the final stages of World War II, a man approached a group of soldiers and spoke in an urgent voice. "There's a factory about a mile down the road," he said. "Inside, you will find many Jewish women who were brought there. The SS is guarding them." As the soldiers cautiously approached the location, they came across a small shed. They hesitated for a moment before pushing the doors open. What they found inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Although the war in the Pacific was still ongoing, World War II in Europe officially ended with Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945. However, in the months leading up to this momentous event, Allied forces relentlessly pushed through Europe, chasing the retreating German army. As they advanced, they uncovered the dark reality of Nazi rule, often by accident. They came across camps, places of unimaginable suffering, established and operated by the Nazis and their collaborators. The Soviet army, advancing from the east, liberated several concentration camps in Poland, including the infamous Majdanek and Auschwitz. From the west, British and Canadian forces freed prisoners from Bergen-Belsen and other camps in northern Germany. Meanwhile, the American forces, the focus of this account, discovered and liberated the camps of Dachau, Buchenwald, and others. What the Allies found inside these camps defied comprehension. Thousands of people, barely alive, stared at them with sunken eyes. Corpses lay in heaps, some in mass graves, others scattered around like discarded refuse. The skeletal figures of survivors barely clung to life, their frail bodies ravaged by disease and starvation. These were the first encounters of the liberators with the horrifying reality of what would later be recognized as the Holocaust. Before this moment, the Allied forces knew that the Nazis had committed atrocities, but the scale and systematic nature of these crimes were beyond anything they had imagined. This was not the destruction caused by conventional warfare. It was something else entirely, a deliberate attempt to annihilate an entire people. To describe these crimes, a new term was coined: genocide. The liberating soldiers became the first outside witnesses to an unprecedented act of mass extermination. Their testimonies, their words, and their immediate reactions remain some of the most valuable and chilling accounts of Nazi barbarity. These testimonies serve as undeniable evidence of the horrors that had unfolded in Europe. Among these liberators was Leon Bass, a 20-year-old American soldier who was among the first to reach Buchenwald. His memories of that day never faded. "I can never forget that day," he recalled. "When I walked through that gate, I saw what I call the walking dead. They had been beaten, starved, and tortured. Their heads were shaven, their eyes hollow. They clung to each other just to remain standing. I saw clothing belonging to little children, the children who didn't survive. I saw their sweaters, their shoes, but I never saw a child." Harry Mogan, a Jewish refugee who had fled Nazi persecution and later joined the U.S. Army, also bore witness. "You saw women lying on wooden pallets. But when I say women, you saw skeletons. Rags hung from their bodies, their feet were bare. Their faces were reduced to bones. And the stench, it's indescribable." At Ohrdruf, a sub-camp of Buchenwald, what the American soldiers found was so horrifying that General Dwight D. Eisenhower, along with Generals Patton and Bradley, personally visited the site. Eisenhower later wrote in a cable, "The things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence and verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. I made the visit deliberately, so that I could provide first-hand evidence in case anyone in the future attempted to dismiss these allegations as mere propaganda." His words are now inscribed in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. D.C. Eisenhower knew that disbelief could fuel denial, and he took steps to ensure the world would not forget. He invited members of Congress and journalists to bear witness. He even ordered American soldiers whose units were not on the front lines to visit the camp. "We are told the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for," Eisenhower wrote. "Now at least, he will know what he is fighting against." U.S. Army Staff Sergeant Horace Evers was among the first soldiers to enter Adolf Hitler's abandoned quarters in Munich. There, he found Hitler's personal stationery. In a moment of defiance, he crossed out Hitler's name, replaced it with his own, and wrote a letter to his mother describing what he had seen at Dachau. "Dearest Mom, I had heard about Dachau before, but I thought it was just propaganda. But no, it wasn't propaganda at all. If anything, some of the truth had been held back. The first boxcar I came to had about 30 bodies, all piled on top of each other. And inside the camp, The barracks were filthy. How can people do things like this? I never believed they could, until now. As American forces neared Dachau, they saw horrific evidence of recent mass executions. Enraged, some soldiers shot SS guards on the spot. But while the camp filled them with fury, it also filled them with compassion. Paul Parks, a 22-year-old African-American soldier, saw prisoners emerging from their barracks. One of them came out and spoke English. He asked, "Are you Americans?" And when I said yes, he dropped to the ground and started to pray. Who were these survivors? They were Jews, whose extermination had been the central goal of the Holocaust. They were also Roma, communists, and homosexuals, anyone the Nazis deemed undesirable. Many of them were beyond saving. Hundreds died each day, succumbing to starvation and disease. But for those who survived, the sight of Allied soldiers was salvation itself. Helen Greenbaum had survived the Warsaw Ghetto, multiple forced labor camps, and a death march to Dachau. They opened the gates, she recalled. Some of us crawled on all fours to greet the soldiers. We kissed their boots. Those who couldn't walk, they carried into the camp. Some soldiers broke down in tears. Others chose to pause their military objectives to care for the sick and dying. They fed prisoners, clothed them, and in many cases, simply held their hands. The liberators, in their kindness, restored humanity to those from whom it had been brutally stripped. Among these liberators was Clarence Matsumura, a Japanese-American soldier from a segregated regiment. When he knelt down and touched a dying boy, he whispered, "You're free now." That boy, Solly Ganner, never forgot his angelic rescuer. Ironically, many of the liberators, African-Americans, Japanese-Americans, had faced discrimination in their own country and within their own army. Yet, they fought for freedom and rejoiced in the survivors' liberation, even as their own families endured prejudice back home. For many Holocaust survivors, liberation was a bittersweet moment. It marked the end of suffering but also the painful realization that their families were gone. They had survived, but they were alone. For the liberators, their experiences in the camps left them forever changed. Trained to fight, many abandoned combat to become caregivers, healers, and witnesses to history. Their testimonies, their tears, their actions stand as an eternal reminder that evil must be confronted and that silence must never allow it to rise again. Are we looking for credit? No, one liberator said. No one wants a pat on the back. All we want is to make sure this never happens again.